In 1852, when the first fever wines rose from the Florida swamps, the Willoughby plantation stood vast and brooding at the edge of Cypress Lake. It was a place where the fog carried secrets, and the earth itself hummed with things that grew wild. Mangroves, willows, the restless gnaw of alligators and cottonmouths. The house was built wide to catch any breeze, white paint already graying under sun and salt, and its rooms were lined with mahogany shipped from Havana before the embargoes tightened. The master of this place, Thaddeus Willoughby, ruled like the river, implacable, slow, and deadly. Some said his wealth was measured not just in butter-yellow coins and acres, but also in the number of bodies planted under the cane, the number of prayers unheeded as crops devoured souls with hunger and hope. On an evening swept by thunderclouds, a new wagon creaked up the Shell Road. The overseer Baldwin spat in the dust, his boots already stained red. He flicked the lantern high as the slave trader, Mr. Fitz, slid from his buggy, waving a bill of sale and talking fast, pointing to the man with the bound wrists and that impossible stillness about him. "No kin," Fitz said, "no past. He comes from the islands, but nobody knows which. All you need to know is he works, and he don't die easy." The man stood silent, eyes lowered, lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a curse. His scalp was ringed by salt-grayed hair, and a curious bag hung on a thong around his neck, stitched from lizard skin. Willoughby squinted, assessing value as he had with every human acquisition. Strong hands, unscarred back, no obvious limp, eyes that burned but quickly shuttered as the master examined him. "I'll pay you $80 now, 100 after first frost if he doesn't run," Willoughby bargained. Fitz nodded, though he wouldn't live to collect the balance. Men who sold what shouldn't be sold often met muddy ends near Florida backroads. In the deep south, where blood and memory soaked the ground and even the wind could seem bewitched, Sabas arrived at the Willoughby place, wordless but carrying with him the storm of centuries, the silent resolve of all who had survived, by knowing when to fight and when to disappear. If you're drawn to stories of justice older than any judge, pain too sharp for even the cruelest master, subscribe and tell where in the world you're watching from. This tale crosses borders and oceans, and the spirits it calls up don't care for distance, only for truth. That night, the new slave, Sabas, ate his supper seated alone near the smokehouse. The other field hands eyed him with suspicion and curiosity. 100 years of suffering had taught them the signs of someone who navigated both the world of the living and whatever haunted the gap between life and the next. Granny May, oldest in the quarters, traced a circle in cornmeal around her bowl, whispered, "He got jab eyes, devil eyes." But when Sabas locked his gaze on her, she froze up and crossed herself twice, then began to hum softly. It was said among the Gullah and the Creoles that a true root worker never ate on Friday nights, but Sabas chewed his mush with slow, thoughtful bites, watching the moon slip behind storm clouds. 2 days passed. The routine of the estate resumed. Bells at dawn shouted orders, the distant crack of ox whips against sky. Sabas didn't speak unless spoken to, but there was a ripple in the air wherever he went. The children dared each other to run past him. When Celestine, a quick-witted girl with a bad leg, left sweet potato by his door, Sabas fixed her ankle with a poultice of boiled moss and crushed blue seeds that no one recognized. She danced straight by Sunday. Maribel, midwife and keeper of the secrets that protected the people from Baldwin's night raids, watched closely and warned him to keep his workings quiet. "Master Willoughby don't tolerate tricks," she whispered in Creole, picking bones from a squirrel stew. Sabas just nodded. "The master answers to the living," he said, "but the land answers to something older." The others prepared themselves for laughter, but Sabas moved down the row with a rhythm as sure as thunder, splitting clay with fewer blows than most men mustered after years in the field. "Don't tire," was all Sabas said, when the overseer spat at his feet and threatened 10 lashes for insolence. That week 4 of the best cane cutters fell sick to fever, teeth chattering and lips blue. Sabas brought them ginger root tea and chicken foot charms, and they were on their feet before the white doctor even arrived to collect his fee and curse at poor housing. The other enslaved kept their distance. Respect mingled with fear, all except one, Pettit, a boy orphaned during the mosquito plague, who began copying Sabas, tying knots in his shirtham, whispering foreign words while staring at the moon. When Mama John, winded from hauling sorghum, told Sabas to break the boy's enchantment, he replied, "The world is too full of men who kill dreams. Let Pettit remember his mother's songs." Inside the main house, the Willoughby family kept rituals of a fading southern gentility. Constance Willoughby, mistress and daughter of a once proud Charleston clan, wrote letters by candlelight lamenting the wild new spirit among the slaves and begged her sisters to visit. Her oldest, Evelyn, pined for books and music, while youngest son Charles studied sabers from attic windows, captivated by a man so silent and yet so radiantly present in this world of ghost stories and punishments. Willoughby himself worried not for spirit stories, but for accounts. Cotton suffered that season, boll weevils thriving and prices stagnant. Debts haunted him, 5 notes at the merchant, 2 at the lawyer, whispers in Tallahassee about foreclosure. That tension bled into his face, a permanent scowl that deepened as fields failed, and stories about sabers drifted toward his ears. "He's followed by a blue heron," reported Baldwin, "and dogs won't hunt in his shadow." Willoughby dismissed such talk, sipping rye on his porch, but the bottle itself began to tremble one Sunday dusk as Sabas walked through the yard, eyes level with the horizon, never stopping or hurrying, white shirt glowing against green dusk. It began with small hauntings. The air grew heavier for everyone. A field hand tasked with beating sabers for a minor offense sliced open his own thumb with a sugarcane knife just before sunset, blood leaving spirals in the dirt that even rain wouldn't quite wash away. Chickens clucked, then grew silent. Maribel's newborns would not cry some nights but woke howling and feverish when the wind shifted west. Candle wax melted into strange shapes, and a wooden rosary worn by Constance blackened, beads cracking until she folded it away in silk and replaced it with a brooch shaped like a lamb. One night, Petty vanished. A search party found him at the swamp edge, cheeks painted with dark river mud, clutching a fragment of crushed ibis egg. Lucky, some said, but that bird didn't nest in cane country. When asked what he saw, Pettit said, "The old ones whisper." Sabas says sometimes the river listens better than the master. Most adults shushed the boy. Others begged Maribel to seek a preacher, but the preacher came one morning, blessed the fields, and left before supper, face ashen, declaring that some houses hold things even faith cannot move. Willoughby's patience ended the night Jonas, his second son, wild with drink and prone to cruelty, woke choking, pointing at the window, insisting he saw sabers standing among the cypress, arms stretched to the sky. In the morning, Jonas found strange marks drawn in mud under his bed, interlocking circles, bones, a feather. Willoughby confronted sabers at the canebrake. The 2 locked eyes, and witnesses later swore the air itself turned cold. "You bring disorder," the master hissed. "You bring nothing but old superstitions I paid to keep out." Sabas looked beyond him at the trembling trees. "I bring only what's owed," he replied, "and no man can pay with silver what was stolen in blood." For that, Willoughby ordered a whipping at dawn, declaring before all that no dark power rises higher than God's law under this sky. But as the lash fell, a heavy cat o' nine, Sabas did not cry. He sang low, half words, half melody, something cold and old that pried at the ear, and by noon, clouds mounted until the sky cracked open. Rain fell for 3 days, and at its end, the lake overflowed into the fields, drowning part of that year's crop. Some said the water turned sweet, others that it ran with shadow shapes that night, fish dying on the shore. As the ground dried, troubles multiplied. A fever ran through the house, sparing none. Willoughby's prized sorrel mare bolted into the woods, never found whole. Constance's sister fled after hearing voices in the guest room, and even Baldwin began to mutter darkly, "A place gone wrong." Willoughby doubled the work, starved the hands for imagined slights, and fell to cursing Sabas's name in every breath. The first grave to open was an old one. Ezekiel the blacksmith found dead after warning Baldwin to respect Sabas's charms. They buried him with a silver coin under the tongue and a root at each wrist, hoping to keep uneasy spirits away. But wolves clawed the fresh earth, and some nights the moon glistened on something pale near his grave. Granny May began burning blue sage in every doorway, and the children whispered stories of the crossroads, where it was said Sabas laid down with the ghosts and spoke their names, calling on justice that made men's bones ache in the dark. When Constance found her favorite hound dead at the foot of her bed with a string of beads tied in its mouth, she demanded her husband end all this voodoo foolishness. But Willoughby, sliding deeper into debt and madness, only shouted for blood, promising no charm could hold back the natural order he ruled by meaner force. The weeks following Sabas's whipping were thick with the kind of silence that precedes storms, a silence that settled over the plantation like fog rolling from the swamp, seeping into corners and clinging to the skin of everyone who drew breath on Willoughby land. Baldwin grew nervous. checking locks twice and sleeping with a loaded rifle propped against the headboard of his narrow cot. Maribel began mixing protective charms from camphor and salt, hanging them above the doorframes of the quarters and muttering prayers her grandmother had taught her in Saint-Domingue before the revolution drove her family across the water. The children stopped playing near the fields where Sabas worked, sensing something their parents couldn't name but everyone felt, a pressure in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes, when even the insects go quiet and the world holds its breath. Sabas himself showed no outward sign of anger or pain, despite the scars striping his back like a map of cruelty. He worked the same rows, with the same steady rhythm, never complaining, never slowing, but there was something different in the way he moved now. Something that made people look away when he passed, because looking directly at him felt like staring into a fire that burned without consuming, a heat that came from somewhere deeper than flesh and bone. At night, he sat outside his cabin, weaving strands of palmetto and Spanish moss into intricate patterns that hung from the eaves and swayed in breezes that didn't touch anything else. And sometimes when the moon was full, people swore they saw shadows gather around him like council members taking their seats, figures that had no bodies but still managed to cast darkness on the ground. Inside the big house, the Willoughby family felt the change most acutely. Thaddeus found himself waking at odd hours drenched in sweat, despite the coolness of the night, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to shake off dreams that dissolved upon waking but left residue, a taste like copper in his mouth, a sensation of drowning in thick black water, voices speaking his name in tones of judgment and accusation. He'd light a candle and sit at his desk, pretending to review account books, but the numbers wouldn't hold still on the page, seemed to rearrange themselves into patterns that looked almost like words in languages he'd never learned, messages from something that wanted him to understand what was coming, even if he couldn't comprehend the specifics. Constance noticed her husband's deterioration, the way his hands shook when he lifted his morning coffee, the hollow look in his eyes at dinner, the sudden rages that exploded over trivial matters, a servant slow with wine, a door left ajar, a child's laughter echoing too loudly through halls that seemed to absorb sound differently now, as if the house itself was listening and remembering. Jonas took to spending his days hunting in the pine barrens north of the property, claiming he needed fresh air and exercise, but really fleeing from a home that had begun to feel hostile in ways he lacked the vocabulary to articulate. When he did return, usually drunk and carrying rabbits or wild turkey he'd shot without pleasure, he avoided looking at the quarters, especially avoided the section where Sabas's cabin stood with its strange decorations and the persistent smell of wood smoke, even when no fire burned. Ruth, the youngest child who'd suffered the mysterious fever, had recovered physically but remained changed. She spoke less, stared at things that weren't there, drew pictures in charcoal that showed figures standing in circles beneath trees, while birds watched from branches overhead. When Constance discovered these drawings and demanded Ruth explain them, the girl simply said, "They're waiting." Sabas told them to wait, but they're getting restless, and no amount of scolding or bribing could get her to say more. The plantation's decline accelerated in ways that agricultural expertise couldn't explain. The cotton continued to fail, not from obvious blight or pest, but from some fundamental wrongness in how it grew. Stalks twisted counterclockwise instead of reaching straight for sun. Leaves developed patterns that looked like faces if you stared too long. Bowls opened prematurely, and the fiber inside was brittle and discolored, useless for spinning. Willoughby brought in experts from as far as Savannah, paid exorbitant fees for men who examined soil and seed, and offered elaborate theories about drainage and fertilization and crop rotation, but their recommendations produced no improvement. If anything, the fields touched by these experts' interventions did worse, as if the land itself was rejecting assistance from those who served the master. The livestock suffered too. Chickens stopped laying, cows gave sour milk. The remaining horses developed a skittishness that made them dangerous to approach, and one morning the prize bull was found dead in its pen with foam on its muzzle and terror frozen in its eyes, though the veterinarian could find no physical cause for death, just as he'd found none for the stallion months earlier. Financial ruin stalked Thaddeus Willoughby like a patient predator. The creditors, who'd been satisfied with vague promises and minimal payments, began demanding full settlements, and when Willoughby couldn't provide them, they placed liens on his property, beginning the legal process that would eventually force sale of outlying parcels. The merchants in Tallahassee stopped extending credit, requiring cash payment for supplies that Willoughby couldn't afford, but needed to keep the plantation functioning at even reduced capacity. His social standing eroded as rumors spread about the strange occurrences at his estate, about the slave who practiced African magic and had cursed the master, about the daughter who drew pictures of spirits and the son who fled to the woods, about the house that felt wrong to anyone who entered it, cold in summer and suffocating in winter, rooms where doors opened on their own and shadows moved independently of any light source that should cast them. Invitations to social gatherings dried up, visits from neighboring planters ceased. Even the preacher made excuses to avoid conducting services in the Willoughby chapel, claiming scheduling conflicts that everyone knew were fabrications born of fear. Meanwhile, the enslaved community on the plantation navigated the deteriorating situation with the careful caution of people who'd learned that white men's troubles often became black people's suffering. They kept their heads down and their mouths shut around Baldwin and the other overseers, but among themselves they debated endlessly what was happening and what it meant for their futures. Some believed Sabas was a prophet sent to deliver them from bondage, that the plagues afflicting Willoughby were divine judgment for sins that cried out to heaven for vengeance. Others feared Sabas was playing with forces too dangerous to control, that his conjuring would bring destruction on everyone regardless of innocence or guilt. That white men's fury at being cursed would fall on all black bodies within reach, and the punishment would be indiscriminate and terrible. Maribel tried to maintain neutrality, counseling patience and caution, reminding people that whatever power Sabas wielded came with prices they might not want to pay, but even she couldn't deny the satisfaction she felt watching Willoughby suffer, couldn't entirely suppress the hope that perhaps this was the beginning of something larger, that if one master could be brought low by the spirits, then perhaps the whole rotten system could be challenged by forces that didn't care about laws or guns or the supposed superiority of white skin. Sabas remained at the center of all speculation, but offered no explanations, no pronouncements, no comfort to those who sought his guidance. When Celestine asked him directly if he'd cursed the master, he simply looked at her with those eyes that seemed older than his body and said, "I called witnesses. I named what was done. The spirits decide what justice looks like. I'm just the one who made sure they knew where to look." When Pettit begged to learn the rituals he performed at night, Sabas refused, saying the boy was too young to carry that weight, that some knowledge came with obligations that would consume your whole life if you accepted them, that being free meant making choices, and he wouldn't trap a child in patterns that couldn't be undone. When Granny May tried to warn him that Baldwin was planning something violent, that the overseer had been seen sharpening knives and checking ammunition and muttering about dealing with troublemakers once and for all, Sabas just nodded and said, "Let him come. Some men think violence is power, but they're wrong. Violence is just noise. Power is knowing what the earth remembers, and speaking its language loud enough that even the deaf have to listen." The confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was brutal and the air so still that breathing felt like swallowing hot, wet cloth. Baldwin gathered 3 of the meanest field drivers, men who'd proven their loyalty through their willingness to brutalize their own people in exchange for small privileges and the psychological comfort of having someone beneath them in the hierarchy, and marched to Sabas's cabin with the declared intention of searching for evidence of witchcraft, bones, charms, whatever devil's tools the man was using to bring ruin on good Christian folk. They kicked in the door and ransacked the sparse interior, throwing Sabas's few possessions into the yard, ripping apart his pallet looking for hidden compartments, smashing the clay pots where he kept herbs and roots. What they found was ordinary enough by any rational standard: dried plants that could be medicinal or culinary, colored beads that could be decorative, knotted cords that could be for securing bundles. But Baldwin declared it all evidence of sorcery, ordered it burned. And when Sabas simply watched without protest or resistance, Baldwin felt emboldened to go further. He ordered Sabas stripped and tied to the whipping post again, announced that this time the punishment would continue until the slave renounced his devil worship and begged forgiveness from God and Master. The other enslaved people were forced to watch, dragged from fields and cabins to witness what happened to those who disturbed the natural order, and they stood in the blazing sun with eyes downcast and hearts pounding, while Baldwin selected his whip and Sabas stood bound and silent at the post. The first strike landed with a crack that sounded too loud. Echoed wrong seemed to hang in the air longer than physics allowed. The second strike brought no cry of pain but something else, a sound like wind through empty rooms, like voices speaking underwater, like the earth itself groaning at the weight of cruelty it had been forced to absorb. The third strike never landed because Baldwin's arm seized up, frozen in mid-swing, and when he tried to lower it, the muscle spasmed so violently that he dropped the whip and fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder and gasping in pain that no doctor would ever successfully diagnose or treat. In the chaos that followed, drivers rushing to help Baldwin, enslaved people backing away in terror and awe, Sabas standing bound but somehow dominant in the scene, like a judge presiding over a court where guilt was finally being acknowledged. No one noticed at first that the sky had changed. Clouds were rolling in from the west, moving faster than natural wind could push them, dark and roiling and shot through with lightning that flickered green instead of white. Thunder began as a distant rumble, but grew rapidly to a roar that shook the ground. And then the rain came not gradually but all at once, a wall of water that hit with physical force and reduced visibility to arm's length in seconds. In the deluge and confusion, someone cut Sabas loose. Celestine would later claim responsibility, though others disputed whether her small hands could have managed the thick ropes, and by the time visibility returned and the rain slackened to a normal downpour, Sabas was back in what remained of his cabin, sitting cross-legged in the mud where his floor had been, humming a melody that made dogs howl and horses scream in their stalls. That night, Thaddeus Willoughby summoned Sabas to the big house for a confrontation that everyone knew was coming, that had been building since the first moment master and slave locked eyes and recognized in each other something that couldn't coexist peacefully. Willoughby sat behind his desk in the study, pistol loaded and visible, brandy glass at his elbow, face haggard and eyes red from sleeplessness and something darker. When Sabas entered, escorted by two nervous overseers who stayed by the door rather than venturing deeper into the room, Willoughby tried to summon the authority he'd wielded for decades, the absolute power that came with owning other human beings and having law and custom and violence all aligned to support that ownership. "You will stop this," Willoughby said, voice hoarse but steady. "Whatever you're doing, whatever devil you've made bargains with, you will renounce it and pray for forgiveness. And I might allow you to live out your natural days in the fields instead of selling you to the sugar plantations where they work men to death in 5 years." Sabas looked at him with an expression that held no fear, no anger, nothing that Willoughby could use to feel superior or in control. "I made no bargains," Sabas said quietly. "I just opened doors that were always there. You spent years closing your eyes to what you did, telling yourself lies about natural order and divine approval and the burden of civilizing savages, and you needed those lies because looking honestly at what you were would have broken something in you that you couldn't afford to break. But the earth doesn't need your lies. The spirits don't care about your stories. They just count what was taken and what was owed, and when the numbers get too far out of balance, they collect. I didn't curse you, Master Willoughby. You cursed yourself every time you raised a whip, every time you sold a mother away from her children, every time you counted your wealth in human bodies and told yourself it was righteous. All I did was make sure the spirits knew where to send the bill." Willoughby's hand moved to the pistol, but froze there, unable to complete the motion. And in that moment, he understood with perfect clarity that whatever power he'd once had in this room had evaporated, that the rules he'd relied on no longer applied, that he was facing something his money and violence couldn't defeat, because it operated from a place beyond his reach. Sabas turned and walked out, and the overseers stepped aside to let him pass, and Willoughby sat alone in his study as the sun set and darkness filled the corners, where shadows moved with purpose and intention, where voices whispered judgments in languages that bypassed ears and spoke directly to the parts of him that knew guilt, even when his conscious mind refused to acknowledge it. The final month of Thaddeus Willoughby's life unfolded like a fever dream, where time moved at unnatural speeds, days bleeding into nights that brought no rest, only an escalating awareness that something fundamental in the architecture of his world had collapsed and could never be rebuilt. He stopped leaving his study entirely, taking meals there when he could be convinced to eat, though food tasted like ash and sat heavy in his stomach like stones. And he slept, when sleep came at all, in a chair with all the lamps burning because darkness brought visitors that only he could see but whose presence was undeniable, cold spots that moved around the room like living things, whispers in languages he didn't know but somehow understood were listing his crimes and calculating their costs. Constance tried once to convince him to see a doctor, but when she entered the study, she found him standing motionless at the window, staring at something in the yard that made no sense. Sabas, standing among the live oaks at midnight, with his arms raised and his mouth moving in silent prayer, while figures that had no solid form circled him like smoke given purpose and intention. She fled to her sister's house in Mariana the next morning, taking Ruth and Charles with her, but leaving Jonas because he'd become as unreachable as his father, spending his days drinking and his nights locked in his room, writing letters he never sent, letters that grew increasingly incoherent and referenced things that couldn't be true. People speaking to him from mirrors, blood appearing on walls that had been clean moments before, the sensation of being watched by eyes that belonged to no living thing. The house staff began quitting without notice, choosing unemployment over another day in a place that felt actively hostile to human occupation, where doors slammed in empty rooms and footsteps echoed in hallways where no one walked, and the very air seemed thick with malice barely restrained. Only 2 people remained by the end: an elderly cook named Hannah, who'd worked for the Willoughbys for 40 years and felt too old to start over elsewhere, and a young housegirl named Mercy, who needed the wages too desperately to care about ghost stories and strange occurrences. In the quarters, life continued with the grim determination of people who'd learned that survival meant focusing on immediate necessities, regardless of larger chaos swirling around them. They worked the fields though the crops were worthless, maintained routines though the plantation was clearly dying, kept their heads down and their mouths shut around the remaining overseers, who were themselves too frightened or too stupid to understand what was happening. Sabas moved among them like a figure from prophecy, neither explaining himself nor apologizing for the disruption his presence had caused, simply existing with that same steady certainty that had characterized him from the first day he'd arrived. Maribel tried multiple times to get him to leave, to run while the chaos provided cover, pointing out that when Willoughby finally died, and everyone knew he was dying, you could see it in his face and smell it on his breath, there would be a reckoning, and whoever was blamed for his death would pay with their life regardless of what supernatural forces might actually be responsible. But Sabas refused to flee, saying the work wasn't finished, that running would leave things incomplete in ways that mattered to forces Maribel didn't fully understand. "The spirits came when I called them," he told her one evening as they sat outside her cabin watching lightning bugs pulse in the gathering dark. "And they won't leave until they're satisfied. If I run now, they'll just attach themselves to someone else, keep collecting the debts Willoughby owes. Better it happens with me here to witness, to make sure it ends proper." Maribel shook her head, unconvinced but recognizing the futility of arguing with conviction that deep. "Just remember," she said quietly, "that vengeance has a cost too. That calling spirits to do your killing still makes you a killer even if your hands stay clean. You think you're serving justice, but justice and revenge look awful, similar from some angles, and the difference matters even when it's hard to see." Sabas considered this in silence for a long time before responding. "Maybe you're right," he finally said. "Maybe I'm just a man who got tired of suffering and found a way to make his oppressor suffer back. And maybe calling it justice is just a story I tell myself so I can sleep at night. But I'll tell you something true, Maribel. Willoughby spent decades telling himself stories too. Stories about natural order and divine approval and the burden of civilizing savages, and he used those stories to justify treating human beings like animals, and nobody ever asked him to examine whether his stories were true or just convenient lies that let him do terrible things without feeling guilty. So if I'm telling myself a story about justice to make this bearable, at least my story doesn't require believing that some people are less human than others. What happens when a slave refuses to let the master die in peace, when the spirits called to witness cruelty decide that death is just the beginning of eternal reckoning, when a man who spent his life denying others their humanity discovers too late that some debts follow you past the grave, into places where wealth and power mean nothing, and all that matters is what you did when you had the chance to choose mercy and chose cruelty instead. Subscribe to witness the final act of judgment. Like if you believe some crimes demand consequences that transcend mortal courts. Share, so others understand that resistance takes forms the powerful never anticipate, and comment what you think justice looks like when the law serves oppressors. The signs of Willoughby's impending death multiplied. His skin took on a greyish pallor that made him look half dead already. His eyes sank into hollows that deepened daily. His hands developed a tremor so severe he could barely hold a glass without spilling its contents. He stopped speaking in coherent sentences, just muttered fragments that seemed to be responses to conversations only he could hear, arguments with invisible accusers who wouldn't let him rest. Baldwin found him once standing in the middle of the study at 3 in the morning with blood running from his nose, staring at nothing and repeating, "I didn't know, I didn't know," over and over, until the overseer shook him hard enough to break the spell. When Baldwin asked what he didn't know, Willoughby just looked at him with eyes that held terrible understanding and said, "How many? I never counted how many." They did, though. They know exactly how many. The doctor who examined him, brought from Tallahassee at considerable expense because local physicians refused to set foot on the property, could find nothing physically wrong beyond the obvious signs of severe stress and malnutrition from refusing to eat. "Your constitution is sound," the doctor assured him. "You're just suffering from nervous exhaustion. I recommend rest, regular meals, and perhaps a change of scenery. Go to Charleston for a few months. Let capable hands manage the plantation. Give yourself time to recover from whatever strain has affected you." But Willoughby couldn't leave, was physically incapable of walking away from the study where he'd conducted decades of business, where every surface held reminders of the human trafficking and exploitation that had built his wealth, where the walls themselves seemed to remember every transaction and were now presenting the bill for payment. Jonas tried once to get his father to leave, literally dragging him toward the door while Willoughby fought and screamed about things waiting outside, things that would tear him apart if he left the protection of the room. "They're in the trees," Willoughby babbled. "They're in the ground. They're everywhere I look. And they all have his face, all have Sabas's eyes, watching and judging and waiting for me to step outside so they can finish what they started." Jonas released his father in disgust and revulsion, unable to bear watching a man he'd feared and respected his entire life, reduced to this pathetic ruin, and fled to the quarters in a drunken rage, looking for Sabas with a pistol in his hand and murder in his eyes. He found Sabas sitting outside his cabin, braiding something that looked like hair or fiber into complex patterns, and the sight of him so calm and untroubled while the Willoughby family disintegrated ignited something in Jonas that had been building for months. "You did this," Jonas snarled, leveling the pistol at Sabas's head. "You cursed my father, brought ruin on our house with your devil worship and African sorcery, and I'm going to end it right now, going to shoot you dead and burn whatever evil you've been working, and see if that breaks the spell." Sabas didn't look up from his braiding, didn't acknowledge the weapon pointed at him, just continued his work with steady hands, while speaking in a voice so calm it was almost hypnotic. "You can shoot me if you want," he said. "Kill me right here, and it won't change nothing that's happening to your father. The spirits don't need me alive to finish their work. I just called them and pointed them in the right direction. They're operating on their own now, collecting what's owed according to rules that existed before any of us were born and will exist after we're all dust. Killing me just means you'll have one more ghost to answer to eventually." Jonas stood there shaking with rage and fear, and something else he couldn't name, finger tight on the trigger, but unable to complete the action, because something in Sabas's voice carried absolute conviction that made the threat feel hollow, made Jonas understand that violence wouldn't solve the problem, because the problem wasn't Sabas, but something larger that Sabas had merely made visible. He lowered the gun slowly and backed away, and when he returned to the big house, he locked himself in his room and didn't emerge for 3 days, during which time he could be heard weeping and talking to himself and occasionally screaming in terror at things that only existed behind his own eyelids. The end came on October 27th, a Thursday morning when the air was cool and the sky was clear, and nothing about the weather suggested that death was arriving to collect a soul that had avoided payment far too long. Hannah the cook found Willoughby when she brought his breakfast tray at 7 o'clock, found him collapsed across his desk with his face pressed against the account books he'd been reviewing, one hand stretched toward the door, as if he'd been trying to crawl away from something. She screamed loud enough to wake the dead, though in this case the scream was far too late for that, and within minutes the few remaining household staff and Baldwin were crowded into the study staring at their former master's body. He was dead beyond any doubt, skin already cooling and eyes already glazing. But what made everyone recoil in horror wasn't the fact of death but the expression frozen on his face. Willoughby died in the grip of absolute terror, eyes wide and bulging, mouth open in a scream that his throat had been too constricted to release, features contorted into a mask of fear so profound it suggested he'd seen something in his final moments that no living person should ever witness. His right hand was clawed into the desk wood hard enough to leave marks, nails broken from the force of his desperate grip, and his left hand clutched at his throat as if he'd been trying to tear away fingers that weren't there. fighting off an attacker that existed in dimensions the living couldn't perceive. The doctor who came to examine the body and sign the death certificate did so with visible reluctance, conducting the briefest possible examination before declaring heart failure as cause of death and fleeing as quickly as propriety allowed. No visible wounds, he noted in his report. No signs of poison or violence, just catastrophic cardiac arrest brought on by extreme stress. What he didn't note, but what everyone who saw the body noticed, was that Willoughby's eyes held a look of recognition, of understanding something terrible, of knowing exactly what was happening to him and why, and that knowledge was worse than any physical pain could have been. They buried him that same day before sunset in the family plot behind the house, a hasty funeral attended by almost no one, Jonas too drunk and broken to stand upright, Baldwin and the few remaining workers there out of obligation rather than grief, no neighbors or friends or fellow planters willing to pay their respects to a man who died in circumstances that smelled of conjure work and angry spirits. The preacher who conducted the service, a Methodist circuit rider who didn't know Willoughby personally and had been paid extra to overcome his reluctance, kept the ceremony mercifully brief, read the minimum required scripture, and carefully avoided any claims about where Willoughby's soul had gone or what waited for him on the other side of death. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, a sound rose from the quarters that made everyone at the graveside go still. Not celebration exactly, but something close, a collective exhalation of relief and grim satisfaction. Voices raised in a spiritual that talked about burdens being lifted, and debts being paid, and the crooked being made straight. Baldwin started toward the quarters with violence in mind, but stopped when he realized he was outnumbered, and that the people singing had nothing left to lose, that killing their master's oppressor had shifted something fundamental in the power dynamics, and attempting to reassert control through violence would likely end badly for the few white people still on the property. Sabas stood at the edge of the gathering, not singing but watching, his face expressionless in a way that somehow conveyed both satisfaction and sorrow. The look of a man who'd accomplished what he set out to do, but understood that victory in this kind of war came with costs that would follow him into whatever came after this life ended. Maribel stood beside him and asked quietly, "Is it finished?" Sabas was silent for a long moment before answering. "The dying part is finished," he said. "But death ain't the end of anything. It's just a change in location. Willoughby's learning that now, learning it slow and hard the way he made others learn about suffering. With Thaddeus Willoughby buried hastily in the family plot behind a crumbling white fence, the plantation seemed to exhale. Relief, fear, anticipation, all tangled into fog that rolled each morning from the edge of Cypress Lake. But peace, despite Willoughby's absence, did not return. The great house now stood emptier than ever, half its windows shuttered, paint crackling in the salty air. Jonas wandered it like a ghost with only whiskey for company, sometimes dragging a rifle behind him along the halls, muttering curses both learned and invented, daring the shadows to answer him. No preacher visited to lay Willoughby's soul to rest. Maribel prepared a small altar in the back of the quarters, lighting candles for the dead and pouring libations for ancestors. But the air remained thick with unfinished business. Sometimes, late at night, the sound of dirt scratching and the soft groan of wood could be heard from the grave. Hannah told the house servants, "The earth don't want him." Mercy, never prone to stories, confessed that when she swept the upstairs landing, she sometimes saw muddy handprints appear and fade in the corners, as if someone lingeringly tried to escape the soil. Sabas never went near the grave, nor did he utter Willoughby's name again, not even when questioned by the newly emboldened members of the enslaved community, who wondered if the justice he'd summoned would ever be satisfied, or if the plantation was doomed to be haunted by retribution without end. Pettit, now a scrawny teenager, tried to sneak away one foggy evening to leave an offering, a chicken bone and a bead, at the dead man's tomb, only to return frantic, swearing he'd heard nails being clawed up from the other side, and a voice in crisp, furious English cursing Sabas, cursing heaven and earth for leaving him alone in death. Others scoffed or prayed harder, but even the bravest no longer lingered by the white fence, not after twilight. To the outside world, news of Willoughby's demise became rumor faster than facts. In town, people muttered about curses and black magic, weaving the tale into warnings for unruly children and for upstart neighbors who might forget their place in the natural order. Merchants who had previously extended credit to the Willoughbys returned his ledgers to Jonas, scrawling, "Dead or damned, no more trades" in the margin. Nearby planters, never fond of Thaddeus, now eyed the estate land hungrily but kept their distance. For every story someone told to dismiss Sabas as just another pain-warped slave, there were 3 others about the unexplained deaths of animals. The black boils that disfigured a neighbor's newborn, the storm that destroyed the neighbor's tobacco barn and erased the bridge across the river. The enslaved on the Willoughby land coped in their own ways. Some left for nearby plantations, hearing rumors they could buy freedom from distant relatives or abolitionist agents when the wind favored them. Others, like Maribel and Celestine, stayed, convinced that roots ran as deep for the oppressed as they did for Spanish moss-draping ancient oaks. Celestine, now tending the sick and dying, became the keeper of story as well as song. She comforted children with tales of ancestors who escaped by taking on the skins of foxes or vanishing into the swamp to join marooned communities beyond the reach of any master. Under her hand, the quarters became less a place of resignation and more a nest of stubborn endurance. Days spent in fieldwork, nights filled with whispered planning, healing, the sharing of names and forbidden rituals. With the collapse of the cotton economy on the Willoughby place, Jonas tried to convert the lands to cattle, but every attempt met disaster. Cows sickened or wandered off and were never seen again. A drought destroyed what remained of the corn, then a sudden downpour washed away the topsoil. He borrowed money against the estate and lost it to gamblers in Tallahassee. By the first snow, rare, brittle, a white dusting that sat uneasy on the branches, the last white overseer resigned, claiming nightmares and unexplained bruises that bloomed on his arms as he slept. Through it all, Sabas moved slowly, steadily. He took on the role of root worker and spiritual intermediary, helping those brave enough to ask him for advice. When Petit's cough worsened, Sabas treated him with a syrup brewed from bay, molasses, and pine, refusing payment but accepting quietly a lock of the boy's hair for later use. When Celestine approached in the hush before dawn, asking if the curse could ever truly end, Sabas told her the truth. Nothing ends, child, only changes shape. A spirit denied peace in life will scratch at the bones of the living, unless the living lay truth on the table and bargain with tears, not blood. Over time, the Willoughby plantation slipped into a new existence, halfway between ruin and survival. Freed by the chaos, formerly enslaved men crossed the river at night to join maroon hideouts or run for Spanish territory, counting on chaos as a cover. Jonas's cruelty reached its breaking point during a fever season that left 3 dead in a week. In a final act of desperation, he rode to town for a preacher and returned with a man in black who stayed for only 1 meal, fled at midnight, and was never seen near the estate again. The following morning, the barn burned to the ground. Whether by candle accident or something less explainable, no one could say. The shadow of Sabas's reputation traveled farther than the fences. Gossip and story wound their way down the river and up across the pines. The voodoo man of Florida could raise the dead, but made them stay silent. He could curse crops for a mile around, or turn mist into fire, or call down flocks of crows at sunset to blot the sky. By the following summer, neighboring planters blamed every blight, birth defect, accident and tragedy on that one conjureman from Cypress Lake. In Tallahassee, it was claimed, a judge found his chambers overrun by ants. After denying an enslaved woman's plea for freedom, her family, of course, traced back to the Willoughby quarters. Despite the growing legend, Sabas refused all offers to work for outsiders. When a free black man from Georgia appeared, asking if Sabas would help spirit his kin away from a plantation near the Suwannee, Sabas gave him only this: "The river is wider than the master's cane. You want freedom? Learn the river's patience and forget my name." Maribel's faith deepened as she aged. She led nighttime circles under the willow tree, combining psalms with chants in Creole and snippets of prayers learned from elders who'd seen Haiti overthrow the French. Her school for small children taught not only letters, but the intricate art of not being watched, of hiding knowledge behind innocent smiles. She and Sabas never discussed the events that had led to Willoughby's death again, but sometimes when the wind shifted, she would hear Sabas mutter a half-verse in a language older than either of their memories. One afternoon, a stranger came to the gate, an abolitionist disguised as a wandering peddler. He offered Celestine a slip of northern paper currency and whispered information about the sea islands, where Union ships sometimes came to free the enslaved. When Sabas intercepted him near the smokehouse, the abolitionist shivered despite the heat and left as quickly as he appeared. Later, Celestine asked why Sabas had refused the man's help, and Sabas replied, Some storms are not for sale. The sea brings freedom on its own tide, not from the hands of men who count their causes like coins. Seasons passed. Jonas drank himself into a stupor that killed him before his 30th year, found broken in a creek bed by 2 children, bringing back kindling. The Willoughby house, once bright with parties and imported china, became an empty echo, windows gaping, doors unhinged. Nature claimed what cruelty abandoned. Ivy crept up the walls, cracked tiles fell in the kitchens, barn owls made their homes in the cracked slats of the attic. The family plot became overgrown, yet the grave of Thaddeus Willoughby never quite vanished. The ground above it remained bare, grass refusing to take root, no matter how many times the fields burned and were reborn. Sabas, now older and thinner, continued tending the sick, healing quarrels and teaching, always by example, never by boast. He trained Celestine as healer, leaving her to guide the children of the quarters on new moon nights. Petite grew into a clever tradesman, carving flutes and whistles that carried strange, mournful tunes across the bayou at dusk. Maribel passed her gifts to a new generation, leaving behind stories of the time when a slave taught the master that no chain could bind what the earth itself remembers. Near the end of his own life, Sabas would sit by the water and gaze across the lake, humming to himself while children watched for shadows, and grown people stayed respectfully distant, both uneasy and grateful for the legend he'd become. The cycle of suffering, vengeance, and memory continued. But the plantation was different now. A place marked by resistance, still haunted by what had happened but stubbornly alive, a reminder that some spells are laid not by words or ritual, but by the insistence that pain be witnessed, that debts be counted and paid. The years after Thaddeus Willoughby's death brought a slow, inexorable collapse to the estate that had once stood as a monument to wealth extracted from suffering, to power maintained through cruelty, to the lie that some human beings could own others without consequence. The fields went to seed, cotton replaced by weeds that grew taller than a man and thick enough to lose yourself in if you wandered off the paths that connected the quarters to what remained of civilization. The manor house deteriorated with the kind of poetic justice that people whispered about in town, paint peeling in long strips that revealed rotting wood underneath, windows breaking one by one from storms or thrown rocks, or perhaps just the weight of their own guilt, roof tiles sliding off to shatter on the ground below, until rain poured directly into rooms that had once hosted parties where wealthy planters discussed the Negro question over imported wine and convinced themselves they were benevolent stewards of inferior beings who needed white guidance. Jonas's death removed the last Willoughby from the property, and in the chaos of settling debts that vastly exceeded assets, the plantation entered a legal limbo that would last decades. Creditors fought over claims to land that nobody actually wanted to occupy, lawyers filed papers that gathered dust in Tallahassee offices, and meanwhile, the people who'd actually worked the soil and built the wealth continued living in the quarters, because they had nowhere else to go, and because something in them insisted on remaining, on bearing witness to the transformation of this place from prison to something else, something that hadn't been named yet, but felt like the beginning of a story they'd been waiting generations to tell. The overseers' houses fell empty, the gin house collapsed in a storm that some said was natural, and others said was summoned, and gradually the clear boundaries between white space and black space dissolved as nature and necessity redrew the map according to different rules. Sabas aged, but never seemed truly old, his hair going white, but his movements remaining steady, his eyes losing none of their intensity, even as the skin around them creased with decades of watching and remembering. He became a fixture of the abandoned plantation, the last link to the events that had transformed this place from an engine of exploitation into a monument to resistance, and people traveled from 3 counties away to consult with him about matters spiritual and practical. How to cure a sickness that doctors couldn't diagnose, how to protect yourself from enemies who wished you harm, how to navigate a world that was changing in ways nobody quite understood, but everyone could feel. He never charged money for his services, but accepted offerings when they were given, small tokens that accumulated in his cabin, along with the bones and beads and knotted cords that had always been his tools, physical anchors for spiritual work that operated in dimensions most people couldn't perceive. But everyone affected by slavery understood instinctively because their whole lives had been shaped by forces that claimed not to exist while determining every aspect of their existence. The question everyone wanted answered but few dared ask directly was whether Thaddeus Willoughby had found any peace in death, whether the torment that had consumed his final weeks had ended when his heart stopped, or whether it had simply changed form, continued in realms beyond the reach of the living. The evidence suggested the latter. The grave that should have been just one among many in the family plot became the center of an ever-expanding zone of wrongness that defied rational explanation. Grass wouldn't grow within 20 feet of it. Trees within that radius developed twisted trunks and branches that reached sideways instead of up. Animals avoided the area entirely, with the exception of carrion birds that sometimes gathered there without feeding on anything visible. People who ventured too close reported feeling watched, judged, found wanting in ways that made their skin crawl and their hearts race, and some claimed to hear voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension, accusations in languages they didn't know, but understood in their bones. One spring morning, a traveling preacher came to the abandoned plantation, drawn by stories he'd heard and convinced in his evangelical certainty that he could cleanse the place of whatever evil presence had taken up residence. He arrived with Bible in hand and righteous conviction in his voice, marched directly to Willoughby's grave, and began reading scripture in tones that carried across the empty fields. The enslaved people who still lived in the quarters watched from a distance with mixed expressions, some hopeful that maybe this white man's God would succeed where their own protections had only managed to contain. Others skeptical that any force Willoughby had claimed allegiance to in life would work against him in death. The preacher read for 3 hours straight, voice growing hoarse but never wavering, calling on the power of Christ to banish darkness and bind evil and restore this ground to holy use. Nothing visible happened during his recitation, no dramatic signs or obvious transformations, and when he finished he seemed satisfied that his work had succeeded, that his faith had driven out whatever had been troubling this place. He was found dead the next morning, collapsed at the grave he'd tried to cleanse, face frozen in the same expression of absolute terror that had characterized Willoughby's final moments, eyes wide and mouth open, and hands clawed into the earth as if he'd been trying to dig himself free from something that was pulling him down. The cause of death was officially listed as heart failure, but everyone who saw the body knew it was the same thing that had killed Willoughby, not a physical malfunction, but an encounter with something that shouldn't exist according to the rules that governed the visible world, something that had looked at this preacher who dared to challenge it and simply decided he wasn't worth the effort of distinguishing from the master whose defense he'd attempted. After that, people stopped trying to cleanse or redeem the Willoughby plantation. It became an accepted fact that this was haunted ground, that whatever Sabas had called into being during his confrontation with Thaddeus Willoughby had taken root too deep to be dislodged by prayer or holy water or any conventional spiritual weapon. The place existed in a kind of equilibrium, not peaceful, but not actively expanding its influence either, contained by forces that even Sabas didn't claim to fully understand or control. The quarters became a strange sort of haven for people who had nowhere else to go, fugitives from other plantations who'd heard that this place was beyond the reach of slave catchers, because even the most mercenary bounty hunters wouldn't enter land that had claimed so many white men's lives and sanity. Gradually, a community formed around the ruins, people who understood that this ground had been paid for in blood and suffering, and that whatever haunted it was on their side, or at least not interested in harming those who'd been its original victims. Maribel passed away in 1867, surrounded by the children and grandchildren she'd helped deliver and raise, and they buried her in a new cemetery, established at the opposite end of the property from the Willoughby plot, as far from that cursed ground as the boundaries allowed. Celestine took over her role as healer and teacher, passing on the knowledge that had survived Middle Passage and slavery, and every attempt to crush the spiritual traditions that gave enslaved people tools for resistance and survival. Petit became a carpenter. After emancipation came officially, building homes for formerly enslaved families throughout the region, and in every structure, he incorporated small protective symbols learned from Sabas, knots in wood grain arranged in specific patterns, nails driven at angles that formed geometric shapes with spiritual significance, doorframes carved with marks that looked like decoration, but served as wards against malevolent forces. The Civil War swept through the region like a cleansing fire, destroying what remained of the plantation economy and the social order it had supported, and when it ended and emancipation became law rather than just desperate hope, the formerly enslaved people who'd stayed on the Willoughby place finally had the legal freedom to match the spiritual liberation they'd been claiming for years. Some left immediately, eager to test their freedom in places that didn't carry so much painful history. heading north to cities where they hoped to build lives disconnected from the land that had absorbed their ancestors' blood and sweat and tears. Others stayed, unwilling to abandon ground that had been paid for so dearly, determined to transform this place from a monument to oppression into something that honored resistance, that remembered not just the suffering, but the strength it had taken to endure and eventually overcome. Sabas lived through Reconstruction and into the era when the promise of emancipation was systematically betrayed by the same forces that had fought to preserve slavery, when freedom became a hollow word for people denied the vote and the land and the education and the economic opportunities that would have made that freedom meaningful. He watched as new systems of oppression rose to replace the old ones, as sharecropping trapped formerly enslaved people in debt peonage that looked different from slavery, but produced similar results, as Jim Crow laws codified the racial hierarchy that slavery had enforced through violence. And he continued his work with quiet determination, helping people navigate the treacherous space between legal rights that existed on paper and practical realities that made those rights almost impossible to exercise, providing spiritual and practical guidance to communities that needed both to survive in a world that remained fundamentally hostile to their existence. In his final years, Sabas would sometimes sit at the edge of the swamp at sunset and speak to people who weren't visible to anyone else, conversations that observers couldn't hear but could sense in the way the air grew thick and the light took on strange qualities, and even the insects went quiet in respect or fear or something between the two. When asked what he was doing, he'd say simply, settling accounts, making sure the spirits know their work is recognized and honored, promising that what happened here won't be forgotten, that the stories will be passed down and the lessons will be learned, that the ground soaked with suffering will eventually produce something better than what was planted in it. He died in 1881, peacefully in his sleep, which everyone agreed was a kind of gift after the violence and turmoil that had characterized his life. They buried him in the cemetery with Maribel and the others who'd built the community that grew from the plantation's ruins, and at his funeral people came from across the state to pay respects to the man who'd proven that the enslaved weren't powerless, that resistance took forms the masters couldn't anticipate or defend against, that some debts followed oppressors beyond death because the universe maintained accounting systems deeper and more permanent than any legal code or economic structure. And Thaddeus Willoughby's grave remained, as it had been since the day they'd lowered his coffin into the ground, a barren circle of earth where nothing grew and nothing rested, a permanent reminder that cruelty has consequences that outlast the cruel, that justice sometimes arrives through channels that bypass human courts and human understanding, that the earth itself remembers what was done on its surface and sometimes demands payment in currencies that can't be calculated in conventional terms. For generations afterward, people would visit the abandoned plantation to stand at the edge of that dead circle and feel whatever it was that still lingered there, still hungry, still waiting for something that might never come, still bearing witness to crimes that couldn't be forgiven and wouldn't be forgotten, no matter how many years passed or how much the world changed around this small patch of haunted ground in the heart of Florida. The story of Sabas and Thaddeus Willoughby became legend, the kind of tale that gets told and retold with variations, but maintains certain core truths, that a slave called spirits to witness his master's cruelty, that those spirits delivered a judgment that extended beyond death, that the grave, which should have been an ending, became instead an eternal accounting where the master who denied others peace found none himself. Whether you believed in voodoo or dismissed it as superstition, whether you thought the hauntings were real or just projections of guilt and trauma, whether you understood the spiritual dimensions or only acknowledged the historical facts, the story remained powerful because it spoke to fundamental human needs, to believe that oppression doesn't go unanswered forever, that the powerless aren't truly without power, that justice exists even when it takes forms we don't recognize or can't predict. The land where the Willoughby plantation once stood eventually returned completely to wilderness, the last buildings collapsing and being consumed by vegetation that grew thick and tangled and resistant to anyone who tried to clear it. The graves remained visible for a while, markers of where bodies had been buried and spirits had been trapped, but even they eventually disappeared under moss and vines, and the patient reclamation of nature that knows better than humans how to cleanse trauma from soil. Only the stories remained, passed down through families and communities, told in whispers and shouts, reshaped by each generation to reflect their own understanding of what it meant to resist, to survive, to refuse to let the dead rest when they denied rest to so many in life. The Voodoo Man of Florida called down a judgment that crossed the threshold of death itself, proving that some debts demand payment in realms beyond the reach of law or mercy, that masters who spent lifetimes denying their slaves humanity would discover too late that the universe recognizes no such distinctions and weighs all souls by the same unforgiving measure. This is the story of Sabas, who taught his oppressor that cruelty plants seeds in soil that never forgets, that spirits called to witness suffering will collect accounts that compound beyond death, and that peace is earned not purchased, granted not to those who demand it but only to those who give it freely to others. Subscribe if you believe history's